I grew up knowing my place in the room before I ever spoke. I was the one people looked past, the one introduced with an apology in the tone. She's smart, they'd say. Just not the pretty one. While millions of dollars were poured into her image, her future, her shine, I learned how to take up less space. I learned silence. I learned endurance. For years, I watched doors open for her that were never meant for me. I watched my worth reduced to comparisons I never agreed to compete in. And I let it happen because staying quiet was safer than being honest. But there's a moment when silence stops protecting you. A moment when it starts burying you alive. Mine came in a room full of people who thought they knew our story. People who believed beauty explained everything and money justified the rest. They were laughing, nodding, applauding. Then someone handed me the microphone, and for the first time I didn't lower my voice. Before we continue, take a second and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. And if stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what happens next. I don't remember the first time I was called the unattractive one. What I remember is how early it felt normal. In our house in suburban New Jersey, labels were handed out quietly, the way people pass salt at the dinner table. No drama, no raised voices, just statements presented as facts. My sister Emily was the pretty one. I was the smart one. On the surface, it sounded fair, balanced even. But the weight of those words was never equal. Emily learned early that her smile could soften any room. When relatives visited, they commented on her hair, her eyes, the way she looked in photos. Cameras followed her. Compliments stuck to her like perfume. When people spoke to me, they asked about school, grades, test scores, things that ended conversations instead of opening them. At family gatherings, I was seated beside the adults listening while pretending not to listen. Emily was pulled into the center, encouraged to dance, to pose, to perform. No one ever said I couldn't join. They didn't have to. I could feel the invisible fence. My parents weren't cruel. That's what made it harder to name what they were doing. They believed they were being realistic, practical. The world treats people differently, my mother used to say, adjusting Emily's dress before a photo. We're just preparing you both for that. Preparation, it turned out, looked a lot like direction. When Emily was 12, my parents enrolled her in a local modeling workshop. It was framed as a confidence booster. When I asked if I could join a writing program I'd found at the community center, $300 for the summer, my father hesitated. He asked if it was really necessary, if I could just use the library instead. That was the first time I noticed the pattern, even if I didn't have the language for it yet. Money flowed easily when it was spent on Emily's appearance. Braces upgraded to clear aligners, hair treatments, dance classes that cost more per month than my entire school supply budget. When she talked about wanting to attend a private high school with a strong arts program, my parents sat down with spreadsheets. When I mentioned an academic camp out of state, they asked me to look for scholarships. I became good at not asking twice. At school, teachers praised my GPA 3.9 by sophomore year, and encouraged me to think about Ivy League colleges. At home, those achievements landed softly like feathers that didn't quite reach the floor. Emily's milestones were celebrated with dinners, photos, announcements to extended family. Mine were acknowledged with nods and reminders to stay humble. Don't get arrogant, my father warned once after I won a statewide essay competition. You don't want people thinking you're trying to be something you're not. I knew what he meant. I knew who I was allowed to be. By high school, the contrast sharpened. Emily had a stylist for school events. I learned how to hem my own dresses. Emily's social media presence grew carefully curated with my mother's guidance. I kept my accounts private, partly because no one seemed interested and partly because it felt safer not to be seen. The comments followed us everywhere. At the grocery store, neighbors would stop us and say, "You must be so proud, Emily's going to be a star." Then they'd turn to me and add, "And you'll do great things too, sweetie. In your own way." In your own way became a cage. It suggested limits I had never agreed to. I didn't hate Emily. That's important. I loved her in the complicated way you love someone who benefits from a system that hurts you but didn't build it themselves. She didn't ask to be elevated. She just learned to stand where she was placed. Sometimes late at night, she'd come into my room and sit on the edge of my bed. She'd complain about pressure, about expectations, about how tired she was of being on all the time. I listened. I always listened. I never told her that my exhaustion came from trying to disappear. The label followed me into adulthood. When I got into a top-tier public university on academic merit, my parents congratulated me, but the celebration was subdued. Around the same time, Emily was accepted into a private arts program in Los Angeles. That announcement triggered a full family meeting. Budgets were discussed, long-term investments considered. Words like branding and future earnings were spoken out loud. I realized then that my education was seen as a personal achievement. Emily's path was seen as a family project. I worked 2 part-time jobs through college: tutoring, research assistance. I paid for books, rent, groceries. Emily's expenses were covered, tuition, housing, even a monthly stipend. Whenever I felt resentment rising, I pushed it down. I told myself this was just how things were, that I didn't need help, that I was strong enough. Silence became my strategy. At holidays, relatives continued the narrative for my parents. Emily's the beauty. You're the brain. An aunt laughed one Thanksgiving as if it were a compliment. I smiled. I always smiled. Inside, something tightened. By the time we were both adults, the label had calcified into identity. People met Emily first. I was introduced second, often as an afterthought, sometimes not at all. And still, I said nothing. Because when you grow up being told your value lies in not needing attention, you learn to survive on very little. You learn to believe that fairness is asking for too much. You learn that silence is maturity. What I didn't know yet, what no one had prepared me for, was how expensive that silence would become. By the time the money started showing up in numbers, I could no longer ignore. I had already trained myself not to flinch. Emily's life unfolded in invoices and wire transfers. I didn't see them at first, not directly. I saw the effects. The upgraded apartment in West Hollywood that somehow became temporary for 3 years. The personal trainer she mentioned casually on the phone. The publicist whose name my mother dropped as if she were a family friend. Each detail floated past me, disconnected, until I started putting them together. It was during my second year out of college, while I was living in a cramped studio in Philadelphia and working my first salaried job, $58,000, a year before taxes, that my father asked if I could help him review a spreadsheet. He said his eyes weren't what they used to be. I said yes without thinking. That was the first time I saw the full picture. The file was labeled Long-Term Family Planning. It looked official, clean. Rows and columns projected returns, expense categories. At first glance, it could have been a retirement plan. Then I saw Emily's name repeated again and again. Monthly expenses, annual costs, 5-year projections, styling, media training, contract reviews, image consulting, travel, housing subsidies. The total at the bottom made my chest tighten. Over $2.3 million spent so far. Projected to cross $5 million within the next 4 years. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, hoping my father wouldn't notice the pause. He leaned over my shoulder and pointed at a column. "Do those percentages look right to you?" he asked. I nodded. I don't remember checking. What struck me wasn't just the amount, it was the intention behind it. This wasn't parental support. This was capital deployment. My parents weren't hoping Emily would succeed, they were ensuring she couldn't fail regardless of cost. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I opened my own bank app. I calculated how many years it would take me to earn what had already been spent on her. Even if I saved aggressively, invested well, climbed steadily, it would take decades. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself money wasn't everything. But money is never just money. It's belief. It's confidence. It's the unspoken message of who is worth betting on. When Emily called a few weeks later, she sounded exhausted. She talked about meetings, expectations, contracts she barely understood. "Sometimes I feel like I don't even own my face anymore," she said, half joking. I asked if she was okay. She said she was fine. Always fine. I didn't mention the spreadsheet. I didn't ask questions. Silence had become reflex. At work, I was building a different kind of life. I kept my head down, stayed late, took on extra projects. My performance reviews were strong. Promotions came slowly but steadily. I learned how to navigate corporate rooms without being noticed too much. I learned how to listen more than I spoke. It was during one of those late nights, sorting through shared family files for tax season, that I found something I wasn't meant to see. A folder mislabeled with my name. Inside were contracts, legal documents, some signed, some amended. I recognized my parents' signatures. I recognized Emily's too, but they looked rushed, uneven, like someone signing where they were told. The language was dense but familiar enough. Revenue sharing clauses, control provisions, morality clauses, penalties for breach, terms that extended far beyond what I'd assumed my parents were involved in. One clause stopped me cold. Any public statements made by the talent or immediate family members that could negatively affect the brand may result in financial penalties, contract termination, and restitution of invested funds. Immediate family members. I read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. It wasn't just Emily who was bound by these agreements. It was all of us. Silence wasn't just encouraged, it was contractually enforced. My parents had signed away more than money. They had signed away narrative control. Suddenly, the years of caution made sense. The careful phrasing, the avoidance of anything that might look like conflict, the way my mother changed the subject whenever Emily hinted at dissatisfaction. They weren't just protecting her image, they were protecting their investment. I closed the folder and didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went to work as usual. I answered emails, attended meetings, nodded at the right moments. On the outside, nothing changed. On the inside, something shifted permanently. For the first time, I understood that my role in the family wasn't neutral. I wasn't simply overlooked. I was strategically invisible. As long as I stayed quiet, I posed no risk. As long as I stayed in the background, the narrative remained clean. I began paying attention in a new way. I noticed how my parents deflected questions about finances, how they referred to Emily's contracts as standard, how they emphasized gratitude whenever she expressed doubt. So many girls would kill for this opportunity, my mother reminded her once with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Emily's exhaustion deepened. She canceled visits home. She missed birthdays. When she did show up, she looked smaller somehow, like she was shrinking inside the version of herself everyone applauded. I wanted to say something, to warn her, to tell her what I'd found. But the contracts were real. The penalties were real. And the power imbalance was undeniable. I was the one without money, without lawyers, without leverage. So I did what I'd always done. I stayed quiet, and I started documenting everything. I saved copies of files, took notes, recorded dates, amounts, conversations. I told myself it was just in case. I told myself I'd probably never need it. Deep down, though, I knew something was coming. You don't build a system that tight unless you're afraid of what might happen if someone speaks. And for the first time in my life, I realized that my silence wasn't just protecting me anymore. It was protecting them. Emily's success, at least the version the world saw, arrived right on schedule. Her follower count surged. Invitations replaced auditions. She appeared on panels, then podcasts, then magazine spreads that framed her story as effortless small-town girl with a dream. My parents shared every article in the family group chat, adding heart emojis and pride-filled captions. I reacted with a thumbs up, the safest response. Behind the scenes, the distance between us grew. Phone calls became shorter. Texts went unanswered for days. When Emily did reply, her messages felt edited as if someone else might be reading them. I recognized the tone. Corporate. Careful. It was the same voice my parents used whenever money was involved. At Thanksgiving, Emily didn't come home. My mother said it was because of commitments. At Christmas, she joined via video call from a brightly lit apartment that looked staged, immaculate, impersonal. She smiled on cue, complimented the decorations, thanked everyone for understanding. When the call ended, the room felt emptier than before. "You know how busy she is," my father said, as if to reassure himself. I nodded. Silence again. In public, Emily's image sharpened into something aspirational. In private, she was unraveling in ways no one wanted to acknowledge. I saw it in the way her shoulders tensed during rare visits, in the way she avoided mirrors when she thought no one was watching, in the careful neutrality of her laugh. Once after a charity gala she was obligated to attend, she came to my apartment instead of going back to her hotel. She kicked off her heels and sat on the floor back against the couch, staring at nothing. "They want me to say yes to everything," she said quietly, "even when I don't understand what I'm agreeing to." I asked if she'd talked to a lawyer. She shook her head. "They already have one. It's handled." Handled. The word felt heavy. I thought about the contracts I'd seen, the clauses that extended like invisible fences. I thought about how carefully my parents avoided conflict, how quickly they redirected conversations that hinted at autonomy. I almost told her then. Almost. But Emily looked fragile in a way I'd never seen before. And I was afraid that speaking would break something I couldn't put back together, afraid that I'd be blamed for causing trouble, afraid that I didn't have enough proof to protect either of us. So I let her talk. I listened. I did what I'd always done. After that night, Emily pulled away again. More appearances, fewer calls. Her life accelerated while mine stayed deliberately small. At work, I was promoted to a managerial role. My salary increased to $72,000. I bought a used car, started contributing to a 401k. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I told myself that stability was its own kind of success. Family events became uncomfortable. When relatives asked about Emily, my parents answered enthusiastically. When they asked about me, the responses were polite, brief. She's doing well. Busy with work. Busy with work became shorthand for invisible. At one dinner, an uncle laughed and said, "Well, not everyone can be the star of the family." He meant it as a joke. Everyone chuckled. I smiled and took a sip of water, waiting for the moment to pass. Later that night, I sat alone in my childhood bedroom and looked around. The trophies on my shelf were academic, debate team, writing competitions, things that had once mattered to me. They felt like artifacts from another life. I realized then that I had been slowly erased, not through cruelty but through convenience. It was easier for my family to invest in one story than to hold space for two. Emily's narrative was marketable. Mine was not. The breaking point didn't come all at once. It came in fragments. An email forwarded to me by mistake detailing brand concerns about Emily's tone in an interview. A reminder from my mother to avoid posting anything political online. A quiet suggestion from my father that I might want to stay off the radar during an upcoming event, just in case. Just in case of what the answer arrived a month later, wrapped in a glossy invitation. Emily was scheduled to speak at a high-profile fundraiser in New York City. The guest list included executives, donors, media figures. My parents were ecstatic. This, they said, was a milestone, a chance to cement her position. They invited me as an afterthought. "It would be nice to have the whole family there," my mother said, her voice carefully neutral. I almost declined. I had deadlines, meetings, a life that didn't intersect with ballrooms and speeches. But something in me, something quiet but persistent, said I needed to be there. Not to speak, not to intervene, just to witness. The night of the event, the room buzzed with polished energy. Everything gleamed. Emily stood at the center, radiant and composed, delivering lines that had clearly been rehearsed. Applause followed her every sentence. Cameras flashed. I stood near the back, unnoticed, observing the machinery at work. The handlers, the cues, the way my parents watched from the sidelines, anxious and proud all at once. For a moment, I felt the familiar urge to shrink, to disappear, to let the story play out without me. Then something unexpected happened. During the Q&A, a donor asked Emily a question she hadn't been prepared for, about authenticity, about ownership, about how much of her journey was truly her own. The room grew still. Emily hesitated. Just for a second. I saw it then. The crack, the human moment beneath the image. She glanced toward my parents, toward the organizers, toward the script she'd memorized. And in that pause, I understood something with startling clarity. This wasn't just her story anymore. It never had been. I felt the weight of the documents in my bag, the notes, the copies, the evidence I'd been collecting without knowing exactly why. I felt the years of silence pressing against my chest. I didn't move. Not yet. But for the first time, I didn't look away either. Because something was shifting. I could feel it in the air, in the tension, in the way the room held its breath. The version of me who had learned to disappear was still there, whispering caution. But another voice, quieter, steadier, had begun to speak. And it was telling me that staying silent no longer meant staying safe. After the fundraiser, nothing exploded the way movies make you expect. There was no confrontation in the lobby, no dramatic argument on the ride home. Emily finished the evening smiling, posing, thanking donors. My parents floated through the room, relieved. The machinery kept moving, but something had shifted inside me, and it didn't shift back. On the train ride home to Philadelphia the next morning, I replayed that moment over and over, the pause before Emily answered, the way her eyes searched the room for permission. I realized then that she wasn't just tired. She was trapped. And everyone who claimed to love her was complicit, myself included. That was the first time I stopped telling myself I was neutral. I began to look at everything differently. Conversations I'd dismissed as harmless suddenly carried subtext. My mother's reminders to be careful what you say. My father's insistence on keeping things in the family. They weren't protecting us from gossip. They were protecting an asset. The documentation I'd been collecting started to take shape as a pattern. I created a private folder on an encrypted drive. I organized files by date, by category, by relevance. Contracts, amendments, expense reports, emails that contradicted public statements, notes from phone calls I'd scribbled down without thinking much of them at the time. Once I started organizing, the scope became undeniable. There were payments routed through shell LLCs I'd never heard of, consulting fees that didn't match services rendered, non-disclosure agreements that extended to family members who had never signed anything directly family members like me. One document buried deep in a subfolder outlined a contingency plan in case of brand instability. It listed scenarios, illness, scandal, non-compliance. Under each scenario were steps to mitigate loss. One step appeared repeatedly: narrative realignment. I sat at my kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. Emily wasn't being supported. She was being managed. I called her that night. She didn't answer. I texted instead, "Are you okay? Really okay?" 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Minutes passed. Finally she replied, "Just busy. Talk soon." Soon never came. At work, my performance began to slip, not enough to trigger concern, but enough that I noticed it. I was distracted, preoccupied. The quiet life I'd built no longer felt sufficient. I wasn't angry. I was awake. My parents sensed the change before I said anything. They always did. During a Sunday call, my mother asked casually if everything was all right. Her tone was light, but there was an edge beneath it. I said I was fine. She lingered on the line longer than usual, filling the space with updates about Emily's schedule, her upcoming appearances, her growth. Growth. The word felt hollow. That night, I reread the contracts again, slower this time. I paid attention to the language about public statements, reputational harm, financial restitution. I imagined what would happen if someone violated those terms. The legal muscle behind them was formidable. My parents hadn't just invested money, they'd aligned themselves with power. I understood then why Emily hadn't pushed back, why she hadn't asked questions, why she hadn't left. The next piece fell into place unexpectedly. A colleague at work mentioned she was attending the same fundraiser circuit for her nonprofit. She talked about donors, about how appearances were carefully curated, about how sometimes, she said quietly, the story presented on stage didn't match the reality behind it. People don't want the truth, she said. They want reassurance. That sentence stayed with me. A week later, my father called. His voice was clipped, controlled. He asked if I'd saved any family documents on my personal devices. The question was framed as concern about cybersecurity. I said no. The line went silent for a beat too long. "Good," he said finally. "We just want to make sure nothing gets misunderstood." Understood by whom? After that call, I stopped pretending this was accidental. They knew I knew something. They didn't know how much. The pressure increased subtly. Invitations stopped. Family group chats grew quieter. When I did speak, responses were delayed, measured. I was being phased out, not dramatically, but efficiently. Emily stopped calling altogether. Then one evening, she showed up at my door unannounced. She looked different. Not worse, just stripped of polish. No makeup. Hair pulled back carelessly. She stood there, hands clenched like she might bolt at any moment. "I can't do this anymore," she said before I could ask anything. We sat on the floor, backs against the couch, just like we had years ago. This time she didn't soften her words. She talked about panic attacks, about scripts she was forced to follow, about threats disguised as guidance. "They say I owe them," she whispered. "They say they made me." I listened. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, I told her the truth. I told her about the contracts, about the clauses, about the money. I told her I had copies. I told her I'd been documenting everything. She stared at me, shock giving way to something else, relief maybe. Or fear. "Why didn't you say anything before?" she asked. I didn't have a clean answer, only the honest one. Because I was taught not to. We sat there in silence, the weight of years pressing in around us. Emily left before midnight. She didn't hug me. She didn't thank me. She just said, "I need time." The next day, my mother called, her voice tight. She asked if Emily had been with me. I said yes. "What did you talk about?" she asked. Everything I said. The line went quiet. That was the moment I knew whatever protection my silence had offered was gone. The machinery was aware of me now. And once a system like that notices you, it doesn't stop watching. After that phone call, the air between us changed permanently. It wasn't overt hostility. There were no threats, no raised voices. What followed was colder, more unsettling strategic distance. Messages from my parents became formal, almost polite. Emily went silent again, not because she didn't want to talk, but because she didn't know who was listening. I recognized the tactic. Starve the problem. Isolate the variable. Me. At first, I tried to pretend I could go back to my life. I focused on work on deadlines and meetings and performance metrics. I told myself that knowing the truth didn't obligate me to act on it. Plenty of people live with uncomfortable truths every day, but knowledge changes you whether you want it to or not. I started receiving emails that weren't meant for me, calendar invites forwarded accidentally, internal memos with my name removed but the thread still intact. I saw how decisions were made, how messaging was coordinated, how Emily's public appearances were adjusted in response to behind-the-scenes concerns. The word risk appeared often, sometimes next to Emily's name, sometimes next to mine. One email in particular stood out. It referenced an upcoming speaking opportunity, an annual conference tied to the fundraiser circuit bigger than the one in New York. Higher profile, larger audience, media coverage guaranteed. The subject line read, Visibility Strategy, Final Approval. I read it twice. The event wasn't just another appearance, it was a pivot point, a rebranding opportunity. Emily would be positioned not just as talent, but as a voice, someone with a story to tell, values to promote. The speech would be live-streamed. Questions would be taken from the audience, unscripted. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with clarity. That was when I understood why the pressure had increased. Why my parents had started checking in, probing gently, watching closely. They weren't reacting to what I'd done. They were preparing for what might happen. A week later, my mother asked to meet for lunch, just the two of us. Her choice of restaurant was deliberate, quiet, upscale, neutral territory. Somewhere conversations stayed civil. She arrived early, smiled when she saw me, hugged me a little too tightly. "I've been worried about you," she said once we sat down. "You seem unsettled." I chose my words carefully. "I'm just seeing things more clearly." Her smile thinned. Clarity can be dangerous if it's incomplete. There it was, the warning wrapped in concern. She talked for a while about family, about sacrifice, about how much they'd done for both of us. She emphasized unity, loyalty, the importance of not airing misunderstandings publicly. "I know you think you're protecting Emily," she said softly, "but you could destroy everything she's worked for." I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I let her speak. When she finished, I asked one question. "Does she know you see her as something that can be destroyed?" My mother froze. Just for a second. Then she recovered. "That's not fair," she said. "We've given her everything." I nodded. "That's the problem." Lunch ended shortly after. That night, Emily called me from a blocked number. Her voice was low, urgent. She told me she'd been warned indirectly to limit contact with me, that people were concerned about my influence. "They think you're angry," she said. "They think you want to sabotage me." I closed my eyes. "Do you know?" she said quickly. Then quieter, "I think you're the only one who isn't lying to me." We talked for hours, carefully, in fragments. We avoided names, specifics, anything that could be twisted later. She told me about the upcoming conference, about how nervous she was, about how the speech felt wrong. "They want me to talk about empowerment," she said, "but they don't want me to talk about control." That was the moment the last illusion fell away. This wasn't about image anymore. It was about narrative ownership, about who got to define truth. I told Emily she didn't have to do anything dramatic. I told her she could keep playing the role, stay safe, wait it out. I meant it. I wasn't trying to turn her into a symbol or a martyr. But I also told her the system only worked as long as everyone followed the script. She was quiet for a long time. "What if I don't?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. I thought about contracts, about money, about lawyers and penalties, and the very real consequences of defiance. Then I thought about the room in New York, about the pause, about the way the audience had leaned forward, hungry for something real. "Then the truth gets louder," I said, "and they lose control of it." In the days leading up to the conference, the tension escalated. My parents called more often, not angry, concerned. They reminded me of how fragile reputations were, how quickly things could be misunderstood. At work, I received a message from HR asking if I'd be willing to attend a professional development conference. The timing was suspicious. It conflicted exactly with Emily's event. I declined. The night before the conference, Emily texted me one sentence. "Will you be there?" I stared at my phone for a long time before responding. Yes. The morning of the event, I packed carefully. Not clothes, documents, copies of contracts, email threads, financial summaries. Everything organized, indexed, backed up in multiple places. I told myself I was just being prepared. That I wasn't planning to speak. That I would sit in the audience and support her silently. But deep down, I knew better. You don't gather evidence like that unless you're bracing for impact. The conference hall was larger than I expected. Hundreds of attendees, media equipment everywhere. Emily was ushered backstage, surrounded by handlers. I caught her eye briefly as she passed. She looked terrified and resolute. My parents spotted me near the back. My father's jaw tightened. My mother's smile flickered and vanished. No one said anything. They didn't need to. The stage lights came up. Applause filled the room. Emily walked to the podium, poised, composed, exactly as she'd been trained. She began her speech as expected. Gratitude, opportunity, growth. Then she paused, just for a second. And in that silence, I felt the weight of every year I'd spent, shrinking myself, every truth I'd swallowed to keep the peace. Someone passed a microphone down the aisle for the Q&A. It stopped in front of me, and in that moment I understood something with absolute certainty. This wasn't about speaking over anyone, it was about finally being heard. The microphone felt heavier than it looked. I remember noticing that first, the unexpected weight in my hand, the faint vibration as the sound system adjusted. The room was quiet but not empty. Hundreds of people sat, waiting, their attention sharpened by the pause in Emily's speech. On stage, she stood perfectly still, hands resting on the podium, eyes fixed somewhere just above the crowd. I hadn't planned to speak. That was the lie I'd been telling myself all morning. In truth, I had rehearsed this moment in fragments for months. In my head, in the shower, on long walks home from work. Always stopping short of the end because imagining consequences was easier than imagining courage. The moderator smiled politely at me. "Do you have a question?" she asked. I took a breath. Not a dramatic one, just enough to steady my voice. "I do," I said. My voice carried farther than I expected. "But it's not for my sister." A ripple moved through the audience, confusion, curiosity. I felt my parents' attention snap toward me like a wire pulled tight. I didn't look at them. I kept my eyes forward. "This is for the people who believe stories like this happen naturally," I continued. "For the ones who think success always belongs to the most visible person in the room." The moderator hesitated, unsure whether to interrupt. The cameras kept rolling. "I grew up in the same house," I said, "with the same parents, but only one of us was ever treated like an investment." Emily's head turned slightly. Not enough for the cameras to catch, but enough for me to see her listening. For years I went on. Millions of dollars were spent shaping one image, training, branding, contracts, legal protections, all of it justified as support. All of it hidden behind words like opportunity and love. A low murmur spread through the room. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Silence had taught me how to be precise. I was labeled the unattractive one, I said plainly. The one who should stay quiet. The one who wouldn't matter if I spoke. The word unattractive landed differently out loud. Stripped of quotation marks, it sounded crueler, more absurd. I saw faces change, brows furrow, lips pressed together. Discomfort rippled outward. My mother stood up. "This is inappropriate," she said loudly, forcing a smile that didn't belong on her face. "We're here to support the brand," I finished, for her finally turning to look. The room went still. I reached into my bag and placed a folder on my lap, not opening it yet. The gesture alone was enough. Paper carries authority. People believe in documents. "I'm not here to attack my sister," I said. "I'm here because silence was written into contracts none of you have seen." The moderator took a step forward. "We may need to let her speak," a voice called from the front row. Another followed, then another. The crowd, it turned out, had opinions. I looked back at Emily. Her face had gone pale, but her eyes were clear. She nodded once. Just once. That was permission. "There are clauses," I said, "that penalize not just the talent, but their family members for speaking publicly. Clauses that define truth as reputational risk. Clauses that turn people into liabilities. My father shook his head, mouthing my name as if to warn me. I ignored him. I have copies, I said calmly, of the contracts, the amendments, the financial transfers routed through shell companies to maintain control. The room erupted, not in chaos but in focus. Phones came out. Reporters leaned forward. The moderator stopped trying to intervene and simply watched. This isn't a scandal, I said. It's a system, and systems don't survive daylight. Emily stepped away from the podium. That movement, small, deliberate, did something to the room. It broke the spell. She walked toward me, not fast, not slow, and stood at the edge of the stage. I didn't know everything she said into her microphone. Her voice trembled once, then steadied. But I knew enough to feel trapped. A collective inhale. They told me this was love, she continued, that the pressure meant I was special, that the control was protection. She looked at our parents then, really looked at them. I don't feel protected, she said. I feel owned. My mother started crying. Real tears this time. My father sat down heavily, his face drained of color. The moderator tried again. We're going to have to pause. No, Emily said. Firm. I'm done pausing. Applause broke out, not thunderous, not celebratory, but resolute. The kind of applause that says something irreversible has just happened. I opened the folder and handed a copy to the moderator, then another to a woman I recognized from a legal nonprofit seated near the aisle. I didn't need to explain. She understood what paper meant. This will be reviewed, the moderator said quietly, no longer smiling. I finally felt it, then the shaking in my hands, the delayed reaction of adrenaline. Years of restraint loosening all at once. I set the microphone down, carefully afraid my voice might break if I kept holding it. Emily reached for my hand. The contact grounded me. Security approached, uncertain who they were meant to escort. The room buzzed with overlapping conversations, but no one was leaving. No one wanted to miss what came next. My parents were surrounded by people asking questions they had never prepared answers for. Words like consent and disclosure floated through the air, sharp and unavoidable. For the first time in my life, I wasn't shrinking. I wasn't angry. I wasn't triumphant. I was done being invisible. As we were escorted backstage, not out but aside, I caught my reflection in a darkened monitor. I looked the same face, same body. Nothing had changed on the surface, and yet everything had. Because the truth once spoken publicly stops belonging to the people who tried to bury it. And no amount of money can buy silence back once it's gone. The hours after the conference passed in a blur, but not the kind that erases detail. This blur sharpened everything. Emily and I were taken to a quiet room backstage, away from the cameras but not away from consequence. People knocked. Lawyers introduced themselves. Representatives from the hosting organization asked careful, rehearsed questions. No one raised their voice. No one accused. That was how I knew this was serious. Systems only stay calm when they realize they're exposed. Emily sat beside me on a folding chair, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Every few minutes she looked at me as if to confirm I was still there. I stayed still. I didn't reassure her with words. I'd learned that presence mattered more. Our parents were not invited into the room. That exclusion spoke louder than any confrontation. A senior attorney from the foundation hosting the event finally sat across from us. She placed a notepad on the table but didn't open it right away. What you described on stage, she said evenly, has legal implications that extend beyond this organization. I nodded. I know. Do you understand the potential consequences of making those statements publicly? Yes, I said. And for the first time in my life, that was true. She turned to Emily. And you, Emily, inhaled slowly. I understand the consequences of not making them. The attorney studied her for a moment, then nodded once. Respect, not sympathy. Within an hour, the story had already escaped the building. Phones buzzed constantly. Alerts, messages, requests for comment. Emily's handlers were nowhere to be found. Whether they had been told to stand down or had chosen to disappear, I didn't know. Either way, their absence felt like a crack in the armor. That evening, Emily and I left through a side entrance. No red carpet, no photos, just cold air and the sound of traffic. We walked several blocks in silence before she spoke. I thought I was going to throw up, she said. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was human. Me too. We didn't go back to our parents' hotel. We didn't go back to mine either. We found a small place near the river, anonymous and quiet. Somewhere no one would think to look. That night, we didn't talk about strategy. We didn't talk about the future. We ordered takeout and sat on the floor backs against the bed, eating slowly, as if relearning something basic. Around midnight, my phone rang. My father. I let it go to voicemail. Then my mother. Then again. And again. Finally, a text appeared. You have no idea what you've done. I stared at the screen, waiting for the familiar tightening in my chest. The reflex to apologize, to explain, to shrink. It didn't come. Instead, something else surfaced, quiet, steady. I know exactly what I've done, I typed back. Then I turned the phone off. The next morning brought consequences. Emily's contracts were suspended pending review. Not terminated yet, but frozen. Payments halted. Appearances canceled. The same machinery that had once propelled her forward now ground to a stop, uncertain. Our parents tried to regain control. They issued statements through intermediaries about misunderstandings, about family matters being taken out of context, but the language didn't land the way it used to. Too polished, too defensive. People were asking for documents now, for timelines, for proof, and for the first time we had it. I spent the day on calls with attorneys, ones who represented Emily, ones who represented independent oversight groups, ones who spoke in careful hypotheticals and took meticulous notes. No one dismissed us. No one minimized what had happened. Late in the afternoon, an investigator asked me why I'd stayed silent for so long. I didn't answer right away. Because I was taught that survival meant compliance, I said finally, and because no one ever asked me to speak. That answer seemed to satisfy him. Emily struggled more than I did in the days that followed. Without a schedule, without handlers telling her where to be and what to say, she drifted. The sudden quiet felt dangerous to her, like standing on a ledge after a lifetime of being pushed forward. One night, she admitted she didn't know who she was without the image. "You're still you," I said. "You just get to meet yourself now," she cried then. Deep shaking sobs she'd been holding back for years. I held her awkwardly at first, then more firmly. For once, there was nothing to perform, no one to please. Our parents didn't give up easily. They requested meetings, sent long emails outlining sacrifices, intentions, misunderstandings. They reminded us of everything they'd provided, everything we owed. Emily read every word. I read none of them. I'd already learned the lesson they were trying to teach, that gratitude could be weaponized. When legal review began in earnest, the story shifted again. It stopped being about a family dispute and started being about governance, ethics, disclosure. People with authority entered the room, people who didn't care about feelings or image. That was when the balance truly changed. One afternoon, an attorney called to inform us that certain financial arrangements would be referred for further investigation. Not because of what we'd said emotionally, but because of what the documents showed objectively. Facts don't care who raised you. Emily listened quietly as I relayed the information. When I finished, she didn't celebrate. She didn't look relieved. She looked tired. "I don't want them destroyed," she said softly. "I just want it to stop." I understood that. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about release. That night, I stood alone on the balcony, the city lights blurred by distance. I thought about the version of myself who'd been labeled early and quietly, who'd learned to disappear to make things easier for everyone else. That version of me had believed silence was a virtue. Now I understood it differently. Silence is only virtuous when it's chosen, not when it's enforced. And for the first time, I wasn't choosing it anymore. The investigation didn't arrive with sirens or spectacle. It arrived with emails, formal letters, and calendar invites that used words like review, oversight, and compliance. The tone was neutral, almost boring. That was how I knew it was real. Power never announces itself loudly when it's confident. Emily and I were asked to give sworn statements on separate days, different rooms, different attorneys. The separation wasn't punitive, it was procedural. They wanted clarity, not cohesion. They wanted truth without rehearsal. My statement lasted 4 hours. I spoke slowly. I answered only what was asked. Dates, amounts, names. I didn't editorialize. I didn't dramatize. I let the paper do the work. At one point, the attorney paused and looked at me for a long moment. "You understand," she said, "that what you're describing indicates a pattern of coercive control." I nodded. The phrase felt clinical distant, but it fit. Emily's statement was longer. When she came out, her face was pale, her voice hoarse. She didn't want to talk. We walked instead side by side around the block until the shaking in her hands stopped. "They kept asking why I didn't leave," she said finally. "Why I didn't say no. I didn't answer right away. Then, carefully, they ask that because they've never been inside a system that punishes you for breathing wrong. She nodded, grateful not to be argued with. The first public consequence came quietly. A major sponsor withdrew support, citing ongoing review. Then another. And another. The language was cautious, but the meaning was unmistakable. Money doesn't wait for verdicts. It senses instability and moves on. Our parents responded with urgency that bordered on panic. They called repeatedly, leaving messages that swung wildly in tone from apologetic to furious to pleading. They asked to meet, to explain, to fix things. Emily listened to every voicemail. I deleted them without opening. This time the boundary wasn't about punishment. It was about survival. The meeting, when it finally happened, took place in a conference room provided by a mediator. Glass walls. Neutral art. Water bottles lined up neatly like a peace offering. Our parents arrived together, but they didn't sit together. That told me more than anything they said. My father spoke first. He framed everything as intention, as protection, as sacrifice. He used the word family often, like a shield. My mother cried. She spoke about fear, about the world being cruel, about wanting to give Emily advantages she herself never had. No one denied the documents. That mattered. When it was Emily's turn, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She didn't even list grievances. She spoke in the past tense, as if describing a life she no longer lived. I didn't consent to being managed, she said. I consented to being helped. Those are not the same thing. The mediator nodded and took notes. When it was my turn, I said only one thing. I was labeled early, I said. And once a family decides who matters most, everything else becomes easy to justify. There was no response to that. There didn't need to be. Weeks passed. Reviews turned into audits. Audits turned into formal findings. The language sharpened. The margins for denial narrowed. One afternoon, an email arrived with an attachment titled Preliminary Determination. Emily read it first. Her hands trembled as she scrolled. It says they can't enforce the clauses, she whispered. The ones about family speech. I took the document and read it myself. The reasoning was precise, almost elegant. Overreach. Undue influence. Lack of independent counsel. In other words, the silence clause was invalid. Emily exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for years. The next development was public. At a press briefing held by the foundation, carefully worded, legally cautious, it was announced that certain contractual practices, uncovered during review, would be referred to regulatory bodies for further examination. No names were named, no accusations were shouted, but everyone understood. Our parents watched it on television. They didn't call after that. Emily's contracts were formally dissolved within the month. Not all at once, piece by piece, negotiated, unwound. She received compensation not as a reward but as restitution. The numbers were substantial, but they didn't feel like victory. Freedom rarely does. The public reaction was divided. Some people praised Emily's courage. Others accused her of ingratitude. They asked why she hadn't spoken sooner. Why she'd benefited for so long before objecting. Emily stopped reading comments after the first week. I read none of them. Because public opinion is loud, but it's rarely relevant to healing. What mattered happened quietly. Emily enrolled in therapy, on her own terms. She started taking classes, history, literature things, with no audience and no metric for success. She cut her hair one afternoon without consulting anyone, and laughed afterward, surprised by how light she felt. I returned to work, but I didn't shrink the way I used to. I spoke more in meetings, took up space without apology. When a colleague once joked that I'd been quiet before, I smiled and said I was listening. Our parents retreated from public life. The social circle that had once orbited them thinned quickly. Without access, without leverage, without the glow of reflected success, they became ordinary. They didn't apologize in the way people expect apologies. There was no grand acknowledgement, no emotional reckoning. But they stopped trying to control the story. And sometimes, that's the most a system will ever give you. One evening, months later, Emily and I sat on the steps outside my apartment, watching the city settle into night. She leaned her head against my shoulder. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't spoken, she said. I thought about the years of silence. About the labels. About how close I'd come to staying quiet forever. I think I said slowly we both would have survived. She looked up at me. But surviving isn't the same as living, I finished. She smiled then, not the kind meant for cameras or rooms full of strangers. Just a small, unguarded smile. And for the first time, it felt like the story was finally ours. Once the investigations moved from headlines to hearings, time began to behave differently. Days stretched, weeks compressed. Nothing felt dramatic anymore, just heavy. The kind of weight you carry quietly, knowing it won't crush you, but also knowing it won't lift quickly. Emily's case entered a formal review phase that required public disclosure. Not a trial in the cinematic sense, no gavel slamming, no raised voices, but a series of proceedings where facts were placed on record, dates, amounts, authority, consent. I attended the first hearing alone. Emily asked me to go in her place. She wasn't avoiding it out of fear. She just couldn't bear being looked at as a symbol anymore. She wanted to be a person again, even if only in private. The room was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled, neutral, a few rows of observers. A long table where attorneys sat with stacks of binders, each one representing a version of the truth they planned to argue. When my name was called, I stood without hesitation. I was sworn in, asked to state my relationship to the involved parties, asked to confirm the authenticity of the documents I had provided. The questions were precise, technical, stripped of emotion. That suited me, I answered calmly. I referenced files by name and date. I corrected minor inaccuracies without embarrassment. I didn't look at my parents when they entered the room halfway through. They sat behind their counsel, smaller than I remembered them being. Not physically, just diminished. Without control of the narrative, without money steering the room, they looked like what they were, people who had made choices. At one point, an attorney representing one of the contracting entities attempted to frame the situation as mutual benefit. Opportunity freely accepted. Resources provided in good faith. I was asked to respond. I didn't raise my voice. Opportunity without informed consent isn't opportunity, I said. It's leverage. The words landed, not because they were clever, but because they were accurate. During a recess, I stepped into the hallway to breathe. The building smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. Somewhere down the corridor, a vending machine hummed. My mother approached me cautiously as if I might bolt. "We never meant for it to go this far," she said. I studied her face, the lines around her mouth, the fatigue in her eyes. For the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt distance. "That's the problem," I said. "You never asked how far was too far." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to negotiate. The findings were released 3 weeks later. They were thorough, unsparing. They didn't accuse anyone of malice, which somehow made them more devastating. They outlined patterns of undue influence, failure to provide independent counsel, financial entanglements that compromised autonomy. The recommendation was clear: all related contracts voided, oversight bodies notified, policy reforms advised. No one went to jail, but everything changed. Emily's public image unraveled, not in a blaze of scandal but in a quiet retreat. Interviews stopped, appearances ceased. Her name drifted out of cycles it had once dominated. And in that absence, something unexpected happened. People forgot. The world moved on. At first, Emily struggled with that. She'd been conditioned to believe visibility equaled worth. The sudden quiet felt like erasure. One evening, she admitted it to me over dinner. "I don't know who I am, if no one's watching," she said. I didn't rush to reassure her. I'd learned that healing isn't about filling silence too quickly. Maybe I said, "You get to find out." She took a sip of water, thought about it, then nodded. I watched her slowly build a life that didn't revolve around consumption. She took a part-time job at a local museum, volunteered at an after-school program. She wasn't exceptional there. She wasn't special. She was present. Our parents tried once to reinsert themselves. They sent a letter, handwritten, careful. It acknowledged mistakes without naming them, expressed regret without accountability, asked for reconciliation. Emily read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. "I'm not ready," she said, "and I might never be." I supported that without question. As for me, something fundamental had shifted. At work, I was asked to speak at an internal leadership forum. A year earlier, I would have declined. This time I accepted. When I stood at the podium, I felt a flicker of the same nerves as at the conference, but the context was different. No cameras, no stakes beyond honesty. I talked about ethics, about how systems reward silence, about how organizations mistake compliance for health. Afterward, a junior colleague approached me. I didn't know how to say no until today, she said. I understood then that taking the mic hadn't just changed my family. It had changed how I saw myself. I was no longer the unattractive one. Not because my appearance had changed, but because the label had lost its power. Labels only work when you accept them quietly. One afternoon, months later, I ran into my father at a grocery store. We stood in the produce aisle awkwardly between apples and oranges. He looked older, smaller, human. I didn't know how to stop once it started, he said suddenly. I believed him. I know, I replied. That was all we said. Walking away, I felt something loosen inside me, not forgiveness exactly, but release. I wasn't carrying his failure anymore. That night I sat alone in my apartment, the city humming outside my window. I thought about the girl I'd been the one taught to be grateful for invisibility, the one who learned to survive on scraps of validation. She had done her best, but she wasn't in charge anymore. Now when I spoke, it wasn't to disrupt or expose. It was simply to exist fully, without apology. Justice hadn't arrived with fanfare. It had come quietly, methodically, leaving space behind it. And in that space, I was finally able to stand. The months that followed felt strangely ordinary, and that ordinariness was its own kind of reckoning. There were no more hearings, no more calls from attorneys, no new headlines to brace for. The machinery that had once dominated our lives had completed its work and moved on, leaving behind a quiet that demanded adjustment. For Emily, the quiet was both relief and grief. She moved into a small apartment across town, nothing glamorous, nothing temporary. She chose it herself, furnished it slowly, made mistakes, bought a couch that didn't fit through the stairwell and laughed when the delivery guys shrugged and left it in the lobby. I guess I'll read on the floor for a while, she said, smiling. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh without checking whether anyone was watching. She stopped introducing herself by what she used to be. No more resume disguised as identity. When people asked what she did, she said, "I'm figuring it out." Some looked confused. Others nodded like they understood exactly what she meant. Our relationship shifted too. For years I'd been the quiet one, the observer, the support system that never asked for space. Now we were equals in a way we'd never been allowed to be before. She asked my opinion. I asked hers. Sometimes we disagreed and nothing fell apart. One evening we sat at my kitchen table, papers spread out between us, not contracts this time, but applications. She was considering going back to school. "I don't want to study anything useful," she said, half smiling. "I want to study something I'm bad at." I raised an eyebrow. "That might be the bravest thing you've said yet." She laughed, then grew thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder who we would have been if things had been different?" I thought about it. About alternate versions of us. About childhoods that didn't divide worth so cleanly. "All the time," I said. "But I don't think wondering helps as much as choosing now." She nodded, satisfied with that. As for our parents, distance settled in like weather. Not stormy, not dramatic, just present. They reached out occasionally. Holidays, birthdays, neutral check-ins. We responded when we felt able. We declined when we didn't. No explanations, no apologies demanded. That boundary held. It was in one of those quiet weeks that I received an invitation I hadn't expected. A community organization, one focused on ethics in media and sponsorship, asked if I'd be willing to speak on a panel. Not about my family, not about scandal, about oversight, about how easily power hides behind good intentions. I hesitated. Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to be defined by what I'd stood up against. Emily noticed my hesitation. "You don't owe anyone your story," she said gently. "But if you choose to tell it, make sure it's because it still belongs to you." I accepted the invitation. The panel was small, intimate, no cameras. Just people who wanted to understand how harm happens quietly without villains or villain speeches. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't start with money or contracts. I started with labels. I was called the unattractive one, I said, not as an insult but as a category. And categories are efficient. They let people justify unequal treatment without cruelty. Heads nodded, pens moved. I stayed silent for a long time, I continued. Not because I didn't know something was wrong, but because silence was rewarded. It kept me safe. It kept the peace. I paused. But peace that depends on one person disappearing isn't peace. It's convenience. Afterward, several people approached me, not with praise, but with recognition. They didn't ask me to relive details. They thanked me for naming something they hadn't known how to articulate. That mattered more than any applause ever had. Emily attended one session of the panel and sat in the back. When it ended, she hugged me tightly. "You sound like someone who knows who she is," she said. I smiled. "I'm getting there." The real test came unexpectedly. At a family gathering hosted by a distant relative, someone asked a careless question. "So," they said lightly, "do you ever regret how everything came out?" The room went quiet. In the past, I would have softened my answer, deflected, made it easier for everyone else. This time I didn't. "No," I said. Calm, certain. "I regret how long it took." There was an awkward pause. Then the conversation moved on. I felt lighter than I had in years. That night, driving home, I realized something profound. Justice hadn't just corrected an imbalance. It had recalibrated my sense of self. I no longer measured my worth by proximity to approval. I no longer mistook endurance for virtue. I no longer believed that being overlooked was the same as being safe. Emily felt it too. She told me one afternoon as we walked through a park that she'd declined an offer to re-enter the public eye, this time on her own terms. The opportunity was legitimate, clean, tempting. "I said no," she said, watching the leaves move in the breeze. "Not because it was bad, but because I wasn't ready to be seen again." I smiled. "That sounds like growth," she laughed. "Therapy would agree." We sat on a bench, comfortable in the silence. "I used to think you were stronger than me," she said suddenly. I looked at her, surprised. "Because you endured," she continued. "You didn't break. I considered that. Endurance isn't the same as strength," I said. "Sometimes it's just adaptation." She nodded slowly. "Then maybe now we're both getting stronger." I believed her. The label that had followed me for most of my life, the unattractive one, felt distant now. Not erased, but disarmed. It had lost its ability to define me, because I had taken the mic, not to perform, not to accuse, but to exist fully without shrinking. And once you do that, even quietly, the world has to adjust around you. The last change didn't arrive with news or paperwork. It arrived one ordinary morning, standing in front of my bathroom mirror. I was getting ready for work, same routine, same light, same reflection I'd seen for decades. Nothing about my face had changed, no dramatic transformation, no sudden glow. And yet I realized I wasn't scanning myself the way I used to. I wasn't looking for flaws. I wasn't bracing for judgment. I was just there. For most of my life, I'd learned to see myself through other people's eyes, my parents, relatives, strangers, an invisible audience that never clapped. I'd internalized a hierarchy I didn't design but still obeyed. Beauty on top, usefulness beneath it. Silence as currency. Taking the mic hadn't reversed that hierarchy overnight. It had exposed it. And once exposed, it couldn't operate the same way again. Emily felt the shift too. She'd started classes at a local college, sitting in rooms where no one knew her past. No one cared. At first, she found that terrifying. Then freeing. She told me once that the hardest part wasn't losing attention, it was learning that attention had never been the same as care. One evening, she came over with a stack of notebooks and dropped them on my table. "I got a B on my first paper," she said, smiling sheepishly. I laughed. "How does it feel to be average?" She grinned. "Incredible." Our parents remained at a distance, not estranged but no longer central. That was the true reordering. They didn't control the narrative anymore. They didn't get to define the terms of engagement. They were just people now with limits they couldn't negotiate around. Once my mother asked me if I was happier. The question surprised me, not because it was unwelcome, but because it was so unguarded. "I'm more honest," I said. "Happiness comes and goes." She nodded slowly, like she was storing the answer somewhere. We didn't push further. We didn't need to. The power had shifted, not violently but permanently. At work, I was promoted again, not because I'd proven myself louder, but because I stopped diminishing my presence. I spoke when I had something to say. I didn't apologize for clarity. People adjusted. They always do. One afternoon, a colleague asked how I'd learned to stay so composed under pressure. I thought about the years of restraint, of watching, of absorbing rooms without being absorbed by them. "I didn't learn it by choice," I said, "but I learned how to use it." That was the quiet victory, not exposure, not revenge, integration. The moment I understood this fully came unexpectedly at a small community event. No stage, no spotlight, just folding chairs and bad coffee. I was asked to say a few words, not because of what had happened, but because someone trusted my perspective. I stood up. I spoke plainly. I didn't perform. Afterward, a young woman approached me. She hesitated before speaking like she wasn't sure she was allowed to. They always tell me I should be grateful for being invisible, she said softly, that it keeps me safe. I looked at her carefully. Invisibility does keep you safe, I said. Until it doesn't. Until someone decides your silence belongs to them. She nodded, eyes wet like something had clicked. That was when I understood the full shape of what had happened. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about interruption. About stopping a pattern long enough for someone else to step out of it. Emily stepped out. So did I. The label that once defined me, the unattractive one, no longer had anywhere to attach. It required my cooperation. And I'd withdrawn it. I didn't become louder than everyone else. I didn't become exceptional in the way stories usually demand. I became solid, and that was enough. Because the truth is, standing up doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like refusing to disappear, like letting your voice exist at its natural volume without shrinking it to make others comfortable. When I took the mic, I didn't win anything tangible. I won myself back. And that finally felt like justice. If there's one thing this journey taught me, it's that worth doesn't announce itself. It waits to be recognized. Often by the person who's been taught the longest to ignore it. Silence can be a refuge, but it should never be a prison. If you've ever been labeled minimized or quietly pushed aside, know this: your voice doesn't need permission to exist. And when you choose to use it calmly, truthfully, without apology, the world has no choice but to make room. I'd love to hear what this story stirred in you. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories about quiet strength and long overdue justice, consider subscribing. You're not as invisible as you were taught to believe.